Beneath the official histories lie pages torn out, voices erased and orders stamped with ink so black they bleed through the paper. In the shadows of the Second World War and the Cold War that followed, men hid atrocities behind code names and consignments, buried their sins beneath oceans and bunkers. What survives are whispers, fragments, and the uneasy silence of those who knew too much, and perhaps understood that some truths were never meant to surface. On the morning of June 27, 1942, Convoy PQ-17 sailed from Hvalfjörður, Iceland, bound for the Soviet port of Arkhangelsk. It was one of the largest and most heavily guarded Arctic convoys to date, comprising 35 merchant ships escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and covering forces that included the heavy cruiser HMS London and the American cruiser USS Wichita. Yet within 2 weeks, PQ-17 would be remembered not for its strength, but for its catastrophic loss. Of the original 35 merchant ships, only 11 reached their destination. The official explanation blamed German U-boats and Luftwaffe torpedo bombers. That explanation, however, does not account for the fragments of intelligence buried deep in British archives, documents referencing an unlisted cargo, a code name whispered in intercepted traffic, object Nachtsturm. The convoy's dissolution began on July 4th, when Admiralty orders reached the escort commander. Disperse the convoy, withdraw the heavy cover, and allow the merchantmen to scatter. The reasoning was the suspected presence of the German battleship Tirpitz, believed to be preparing to sortie from Trondheim. But the signal's intelligence leading to that conclusion remains suspiciously incomplete. Declassified ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park, released decades later, show heavy redactions on the pages covering early July. What is visible reveals not just chatter about Tirpitz, but references to Nachtsturmverladung, translated roughly as Nachtsturm, loading. No explanation accompanies the phrase. Survivors of the scattered convoy told unsettlingly similar stories. Captain Harold Innes of the Hartlebury later testified in a 1946 Board of Inquiry that he received no air raid sirens, no advance warning, only a suffocating silence across the horizon before Junkers 88 bombers struck. Another survivor, Norwegian seaman Lars Christensen, claimed that one merchant vessel, the name redacted in his file, was not sunk by torpedoes at all, but seemed to disintegrate from within. His account was quietly filed under unsubstantiated. Admiralty File ADM 223451, a typed note dated July 17, 1942, appears. Priority cargo possibly compromised. Nachtsturm consignment presumed lost. Issue no acknowledgement to Soviets. The page following is missing. A handwritten annotation in the margin simply reads, "Withdrawn, 1951." If Nachtsturm was real, what was it? Soviet naval intelligence. Documents discovered in Moscow archives after 1991 provide tantalizing but fragmented hints. One ciphered report to Admiral Golovko of the Northern Fleet describes rumors of a German device transferred aboard convoy freighter, disguised under Lend-Lease manifest. The same report suggests British complicity, noting that no Soviet officers were permitted to inspect certain holds before departure. Another Soviet memo, this one stamped by Smersh in 1943, lists Nachtsturm, alongside codenames already known to refer to German Wunderwaffen projects, such as Seelenturm and Donnerkeil. The timing is significant. In mid-1942, German weapons research was diversifying into acoustic torpedoes, long-range guided munitions, and experimental radar systems. The possibility that Nachtsturm referred to one such prototype, captured, stolen, or traded, cannot be dismissed. But why risk smuggling it through the deadly Arctic route? There is one more clue. In 1958, a classified Admiralty Memorandum, DEFE 2572, declassified in part in 2002, surfaced briefly before being withdrawn again. It contains a line that has haunted historians ever since. Nachtsturm material conclusively unrecovered. Location presumed 73°15N, 21°40E. Salvage attempts deemed impracticable due to contamination risk. Those coordinates, plotted, On a naval chart fall deep in the Barents Sea near the wreck sites of several PQ-17 ships. Contamination risk. The phrase raises disturbing possibilities. Was Kyshtym some form of radiological weapon, a precursor to the so-called dirty bombs theorized during the war, or perhaps an early attempt at nuclear material transport, hidden under the cover of convoy supply crates? If so, its presence within PQ-17 would explain the extraordinary secrecy and the reluctance of both Britain and the Soviet Union to admit what was lost. Testimonies collected decades later reinforce the unease. In 1963, the widow of Petty Officer George Latham, one of PQ-17's escort sailors, gave an interview to the Manchester Guardian in which she recounted her husband's final letters. In one, dated June 29, 1942, he mentioned an order to guard one ship above all others, though we aren't told why. It's not ammunition, it's not tanks, it's something none of us understand. The letter was never printed. The interview notes were reportedly confiscated by the Ministry of Defense. By the early 1970s, Soviet oceanographic expeditions claimed to have located at least 3 PQ-17 wrecks. One, identified as the Paulus Potter, was documented but never surveyed thoroughly. Rumors circulated among divers that the Soviets had encountered sealed containers of unknown alloy, and that at least one diver died from unexplained causes after surfacing. No official Soviet report confirms this, but in 1974, the Soviet Navy issued a blanket ban on unauthorized diving in the area. To this day, Kyshtym remains absent from official histories of the convoy. Schoolbooks still describe PQ-17's tragedy as a strategic blunder, the result of overreaction to phantom reports of Tirpitz. But within the faded pages of naval files and the whispered recollections of survivors, another story flickers. It is the story of a convoy not just sacrificed, but carrying a secret cargo, one so sensitive that its loss was buried under black ink and silence. In 2005, researchers at the National Archives in Kew requested the release of the remaining sealed PQ-17 files. The Ministry of Defense refused, citing continuing implications for national security. More than 6 decades after Kyshtym slipped beneath Arctic ice, the truth remains locked away, leaving only speculation, fragments, and the haunting sense that PQ-17 sailors died not merely for strategy, but to protect something the world was never meant to know. In the final days of April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, Allied High Command launched Operation Eclipse, an urgent plan to seize Bavaria before Soviet forces could advance deeper into Germany. The official narrative speaks of capturing Munich, securing Berchtesgaden, and cutting off any last Nazi redoubts in the Alps. But buried within American and British war diaries is a parallel account, one not listed in Eisenhower's published directives: the removal of priority cargo, Lebensborn, division from a small airfield near Augsburg. The files suggest something far more sensitive than prisoners of war or stolen archives, something that vanished between front lines and post-war tribunals. The first indication appears in Chief Operational Log 125645, dated May 2, 1945. Amid routine entries about troop movements, one page lists an unscheduled transfer from Augsburg sector, high-value detainees and materials, escort by 7708th Truck Company. No further details are given, and the log ends abruptly. Cross-referencing with the 7708th's unit history reveals a peculiar gap. From May 2 to May 6th, no convoy manifest survive, though the unit was fully operational. Only a single payroll sheet confirms trucks were on the road during those days. A separate British file, WWII 862, sheds more light. Written by a liaison officer attached to the US 7th Army, the report notes unusual American insistence on restricting access to detainees from Augsburg holding site. Rumors indicate technical staff, not political prisoners. Reference made to propulsion research, possibly V-weapons or jet aircraft derivatives. The note is unsigned, its author redacted by later censors. What happened in Augsburg at that time? Local testimonies hint at strange activity. In 1951, German farmer Erich Metzger told investigators that he saw American trucks parked at the Lechfeld Air Base in early May 1945. He claimed they loaded long cylindrical containers from a Chia hangar formerly used by Messerschmitt engineers. Metzger insisted he was ordered away at gunpoint when he tried to approach. His statement was archived, then forgotten, until rediscovered in a Bavarian police file decades later. The connection to Messerschmitt is troubling. Lechfeld had been the testing ground for the Me-262 jet fighter and other late-war experiments. Allied forces captured not only airframes, but also entire teams of engineers. Most are accounted for in Operation Paperclip records, men like Werner von Braun and Hans von Ohain. Yet scattered references in U.S. Army interrogation transcripts, CSDICA's U.S. 1745, mention 3 unnamed engineers from Augsburg who were detained separately for special handling. Their names never appear in Nuremberg testimony, nor in paperclip transfers. They simply vanish. Soviet archives suggest the disappearance was deliberate. In a 1946 NKVD summary sent to Stalin, recovered after the USSR's collapse, analysts noted, reports from German sources indicate Western allies concealed certain Augsburg personnel associated with Sonnenrad propulsion. Evidence unclear, whether theoretical or experimental, no access given to Soviet inspection teams. The same report accuses the Americans of securing advantage in atomic or aeronautical fields by deception. The Augsburg connection resurfaced briefly in 1969, when a retired U.S. Air Force colonel, William Hartman, gave a private lecture at MIT. A transcript preserved in the university library records Hartman's remark. There were assets taken from Augsburg that never saw Nuremberg, never saw Washington. They went straight underground. Some of what became our classified propulsion projects didn't come from von Braun. It came from 3 ghosts we don't name. Shortly after, Hartman refused further interviews on the subject. Even the term priority cargo Lebensborn division raises questions. Lebensborn was officially a Nazi program promoting Aryan births, not technology. Why use that code name for captured engineers or devices? One theory suggests misdirection. By labeling files under Lebensborn, record keepers could disguise transfers that had nothing to do with the subject, ensuring historians and auditors would overlook them. Another theory proposes a link to rumors of SS medical or genetic research tied to long-range survival missions. No definitive evidence supports either claim, but the ambiguity persists. American truck logs, what little survive, contain one chilling clue. In a manifest fragment, found in NARA Record Group 338, a single line reads, Cargo 7, sealed unit, temperature sensitive, no opening authorized. The page is water damaged, but the handwriting of the officer in charge, Captain R. Ellsworth, matches other verified records. His signature appears beneath a faded stamp. Property of U.S. War Department, do not photograph. What became of the Augsburg detainees and their cargo? The trail ends in May 1945. By June, U.S. intelligence files list Augsburg only as a cleared sector. No mention of detainees, engineers, or materials survives. In the Nuremberg archives, where SS scientists were catalogued and interrogated, there appears no reference to Nachtsturm Sonnenrad or Augsburg specialists. It is as if they never existed. In 1983, during declassification hearings in Washington, Congressman Thomas Downey pressed the Department of Defense on missing paperclip files. One exchange, buried in the hearing transcript, stands out. When asked about non-registered Augsburg assets, a Pentagon official replied, "That subject remains restricted due to Cold War implications. Release could undermine strategic commitments made in the 1950s." The line was struck from the final report, but survives in stenographers' notes. Local folklore in Augsburg preserves another layer. Elder residents still speak of Die verschwundene Kolonne, the vanished convoy that drove out of Lechfeld and was never seen again. Some whisper that the trucks carried not men but machines, prototypes so advanced they looked alien to farmers accustomed to horse-drawn carts. Whether exaggeration or memory distorted by fear, these stories echo the silence left by missing files. Today, historians can only piece together fragments, a convoy without a manifest, detainees without names, engineers without graves. Operation Eclipse is remembered as a triumph of Allied speed and coordination, but hidden beneath that story is a darker one, the quiet erasure of lives and knowledge, absorbed or destroyed before they could reach courtroom or classroom. Augsburg's priority cargo remains a phantom in military history, locked away in blacked-out files and the shadows of Cold War secrecy. When Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Kriegsmarine was thought to have ceased operations entirely. Yet scattered intelligence from Allied naval commands suggested something different. German U-boats continuing missions for months after the capitulation, sailing toward destinations far from Europe. The most tantalizing evidence comes from a cache of incomplete records found in Kiel in 1946. Among the papers, one file bore a chilling title, Project Seawolf. It described submarine supply routes, coded transfers of unspecified biological material, and rendezvous points near South America. The official stance remains that these files were either fabrications or post-war propaganda. Still too many fragments align to dismiss. The Kiel papers were first catalogued under British file ADM 239-918. They describe late April 1945 orders from the Oberkommando der Marine directing several U-boats to remain at sea beyond surrender. The boats listed, U-530, U-977, and two others whose numbers are smudged beyond recognition, were tasked with continuation of Auftrag Seawolf. Notably, U-530 and U-977 did indeed surface months later in Argentina. U-530 surrendered at Mar del Plata on July 10, 1945. U-977 followed on August 17th. Both crews were interrogated. Both claimed they had been fleeing to South America, but the Kiel files suggest otherwise. They were carrying something. American ONI reports on the interrogations, NARA RG-38 ONI Report 1545, reveal inconsistencies. The commander of U-530, Otto Vermuth, stated his boat had jettisoned its torpedoes before arrival. Witnesses confirmed the tubes were empty. But Argentine dockworkers later testified that sealed crates had been unloaded before the Americans inspected the submarine. The testimony was dismissed as rumor, though Argentine naval officers privately noted the crates' removal in handwritten margins of their logs. Those notes, still in the Archivo General de la Armada, are dated July 11th, one day after the official surrender of U-530. Another disturbing piece comes from a British intelligence intercept dated May 18, 1945, 2 weeks after Germany's surrender. Station Gibraltar recorded a faint transmission. Seawolf Südpfad secured, cargo maintained. The source was triangulated somewhere in the mid-Atlantic. By the time Allied surface ships reached the area, nothing remained. Officially, the signal was unverified interference. Unofficially, it was logged as KTB fragment, a reference to Kriegstagebuch, or war diary. That logbook, if it existed, has never surfaced. The Soviets, too, were aware. A declassified NKVD report, Font 3, Opus 8, Delo 147, describes an informant in Buenos Aires reporting the landing of German submarines along the Patagonian coast in mid-1946. The report specifies crates marked with the double lightning bolt insignia of the SS. The informant claimed some cargo was transferred to trucks bound for Bariloche, a region already suspected of harboring Nazi émigrés. Soviet analysts concluded likely transfer of documents and research related to biological experimentation. Materials origin presumed to be Dachau or Oranienburg. Again, the language is cautious but unmistakable. What of the crews? American. Counterintelligence followed several former submariners after their release from Argentine custody. One name, Hans Albrecht Prochnow, appears in CIC surveillance files through 1951. Prochnow allegedly visited both Chile and Brazil, meeting with ex-SS men tied to the rumored Odessa escape network. Then, without explanation, the trail ends. His file is marked Transferred to Foreign Assets section closed. The final page is missing. Project Seawolf itself was not unknown to the Allies. In April 1945, the US Navy issued alerts warning of Operation Seawolf, a last-ditch plan to deploy U-boats against the American eastern seaboard. Convoys were rerouted, destroyer patrols increased, yet the operation never materialized. Official records dismiss it as a phantom, a bluff to stretch Allied resources. But if the Kiel file is genuine, Seawolf may have had a second purpose. Not attack, but escape. The nature of the biological material remains the darkest question. Was it scientific data, samples, personnel? An obscure entry in the Kiel cache, scribbled in pencil, lists Ladung, BM-17, BM-23, unter SS Bewachung. Translated, cargo, BM-17, BM-23, under SS Guard. The initials have never been decoded. Some suggest biologisches material. Others argue BM might denote Baugruppe Messerschmitt, engineering components. Without the rest of the file, speculation reigns. Argentina's naval records contain their own silences. Requests by historians in the 1990s to access full Mar del Plata logs were denied on grounds of national security. One officer privately admitted to journalist Uki Gonyi that the submarines brought things we could not declare, things even Perón wished forgotten. A decade later, divers claimed to have found wrecks of German origin off the Patagonian coast. None were officially identified. Rumors of gold, documents, or corpses circulate, but nothing definitive emerges. The US Navy conducted classified expeditions in the South Atlantic during the early Cold War, ostensibly to map seabeds and currents. Yet the logs of Operation Cabot, 1947, and Operation Red Hat, 1948, contain vague references to magnetically anomalous sites near Tierra del Fuego. Critics argue these were natural formations. Others suspect they were submarine wrecks deliberately, unrecorded. The files remain restricted. By the mid-1950s, the Odessa submarine files had faded from intelligence chatter. The Cold War shifted focus to Soviet capabilities, and the last ghost U-boats slipped into legend. But pieces continue to surface. In 1999, an Argentine fisherman dredged up a corroded steel container near Golfo Nuevo. Inside were documents so degraded that only one page was legible. The page bore a faint eagle stamp and the words, Project Seawolf, End Phase, 1945. Before further analysis, the container was seized by Argentine naval authorities. No report followed. The persistence of gaps, vanished files, missing crewmen, erased testimonies, suggests deliberate concealment. Whether it was the Allies suppressing evidence of Nazi scientists smuggled across oceans, or Argentina protecting the legacy of Perón's post-war bargains, the effect is the same. The truth lies scattered beneath Atlantic waves and buried in archives no historian has yet opened. In the end, Project Seawolf remains a shadow, half fact, half rumor. A convoy of submarines carrying secrets too dangerous to acknowledge, slipping into South American waters under the world's gaze yet beyond its reach. And somewhere along the cold, empty shores of Patagonia, crates marked with runes and eagles may still rest, guarded by silence deeper than the ocean itself. On September 29, 1957, a catastrophic explosion tore through a nuclear facility near Kyshtym in the southern Urals, deep inside the Soviet Union's closed Chelyabinsk 40 complex. The Soviets never admitted the incident at the time, yet in Western WWII intelligence circles whispers of something unusual reached the highest levels weeks before the disaster, broke into local Soviet rumor. According to a declassified fragment from Britain's Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, a cryptic signal was intercepted by NATO listening stations in Turkey on September 10th. The file, labeled Gamma Priority Kyshtym Incident, carried references not only to a containment breach, but to captured German isotopes, a phrase that still puzzles historians. The intercept was logged at a facility near Diyarbakir, Turkey, where American and British operators monitored Soviet frequencies. The transcript, preserved in NSA, Record 2371A, partially released in 2003, reads, Gamma Priority. Ural installation compromised. Isotopes traced to Reich Transport 1945 consignment. containment breach imminent. The coordinates were obscured in static, but the word Kyshtym is legible in the surviving fragment. Within hours, the message was relayed to SHAPE headquarters in Paris, then to Washington and London. Officially, nothing was done. Unofficially, NATO classified the intercept at a level above atomic test alerts. The mention of Reich Transport 1945 consignment points backward toward the last months of World War II. As Allied and Soviet troops closed in on Germany, numerous records confirm that Nazi nuclear experiments, crude though they were, produced small quantities of radioactive materials. These included uranium cubes used in Heisenberg's failed reactor, thorium samples, and traces of isotopes shipped to various sites. The Soviets seized many such caches in Thuringia and Saxony, yet scattered reports indicate certain shipments vanished during the chaos. Soviet intelligence may have relocated them to Chelyabinsk for further study, integrating them into early reactor designs. A British Foreign Office memorandum from 1961, uncovered by historian David Holloway, notes, "There exists concern that Soviet nuclear development was hastened by utilization of non-indigenous isotopic stockpiles, some of which may derive from German war-era materials." Cross-reference to Kyshtym incident shows alarming correlation with 1945 seizure logs. The memo is heavily censored, with entire paragraphs blacked out. Still, the link between the 1957 disaster and wartime German materials was clearly a point of unease. Witnesses inside the Soviet Union described the Kyshtym explosion as unlike anything previously seen. Villagers reported a pillar of fire rising from the Mayak plant and a silent white ash falling over fields. Thousands were evacuated in secrecy. Many more were exposed to radiation for years afterward. Yet official Soviet acknowledgement only came in 1989. By then, Western intelligence had been aware for decades, but bound by their own silence. Why? A possible answer lies in NATO archive document AC 35-112, still partially classified. Meeting minutes from Brussels in October 1957 include the line, "Discussion of Ural incident suppressed, per Anglo-American request, due to cross-contamination of German seizure files." This suggests Western governments feared their own wartime dealings, perhaps joint studies of captured German isotopes, would come to light if Kyshtym's origins were revealed. The phrase cross-contamination recurs in both British and American notes, always tied to seizures in 1945. The Soviets themselves treated the matter with extreme sensitivity. A surviving NKVD report from 1946 mentions Operation Sternfluss, the relocation of scientific materials from Germany to the Urals. Among the shipments, uranium ingots, experimental shielding devices, and isotopes of uncertain stability. Some were reportedly marked with Our Gesellschaft, the Berlin firm that supplied the Nazi atomic effort. If such materials were integrated clumsily into Mayak's reactors, the stage may have been set for disaster a decade later. In 1972, a retired GCHQ operator named Michael Pritchard gave an off-record interview to a BBC producer. He recalled listening to the 1957 Intercept. It was panicked, clipped, like someone sending a warning they weren't supposed to send. The phrase I'll never forget was, "Reich isotopes unstable." We weren't told to analyze it. We were told to bury it. The interview was never broadcast. The notes remained in BBC archives, forgotten until uncovered in the 1990s. Further fragments emerged after the Cold War. In 1993, Russian dissident scientists leaked portions of an internal report titled Legacy Contamination at Chelyabinsk 40. One section, later authenticated, states samples from Facility B traced to foreign origin, predating Soviet synthesis capacity. Documentation incomplete, presumed war trophies. No mention of Germany appears directly, but the implication is unavoidable. Western analysts quickly tied the language to the old NATO intercept. Why, then, did NATO elevate the 1957 intercept above atomic test alerts? One possibility is fear of escalation. If it became known that Soviet reactors were unstable due to mishandled German wartime materials, it could imply vulnerability, or worse, deliberate concealment of illicit technology. Publicizing this could have triggered accusations of war crimes, both against the Soviets who used human labor at Mayak and against Western allies who may have bartered or seized materials in 1945 without oversight. Silence became the safer option. Even today, the Kyshtym incident remains shrouded in uncertainty. Declassified U.S. Air Force aerial surveys from late 1957 show a massive exclusion zone around Chelyabinsk, but no official analysis accompanies the images. A CIA memorandum from November that year merely states, Gamma Intercept source confirmed, details suppressed until further notice. The phrase, until further notice, has never been rescinded. In local Russian memory, the Kyshtym disaster is recalled as a tragedy of secrecy. Villages poisoned, families uprooted, and survivors told nothing. But in the deeper layers of Cold War intelligence, it represents something darker, the buried connection between Nazi Germany's aborted nuclear ambitions and the Soviet Union's reckless acceleration into the atomic age. The captured German isotopes mentioned in that 1957 intercept may have been small, unstable, even trivial scientifically. Yet their symbolic weight was enormous. They tied together the shadows of World War II with the paranoia of the Cold War, leaving a trail of blacked-out files and unanswered transmissions. The Kyshtym signal remains one of NATO's least explained archival mysteries. It was heard once, recorded once, then buried beneath silence. The disaster that followed killed thousands and scarred the Urals for generations. Whether the origins lay in Soviet mismanagement, German war spoils, or both, the truth is still locked away in vaults marked Gamma Priority. And so the question endures, what exactly was carried out of Germany in 1945, only to explode 12 years later in the hidden heart of the Soviet Union? In December 1981, as martial law descended upon Poland, construction crews working beneath the Ministry of Defense in Warsaw uncovered a sealed chamber. Within it lay rusting crates stamped with the Wehrmacht eagle. Expecting weapons or archives, workers instead found reels of magnetic tape and folders marked Einsatzgruppe Epsilon. The discovery should have shaken Europe, yet almost immediately Soviet officers arrived, seized the materials, and ordered silence. What exactly had been buried in Warsaw's soil, and why would both East and West collude to suppress it? The first clue comes from Polish security service files, declassified after 1989. One memo dated January 4, 1982, describes unauthorized excavation under central building, crates bearing German insignia, contents transferred under direct supervision of GRU liaison officers. The same memo warns of high destabilization risk if documents publicized. The file includes a list of items, 17 reels of tape, 9 folders of typed reports, and a sealed metal container. No details of the container's contents appear. By February, the memo was reclassified, top secret, category crimson, and withdrawn. From circulation, archival evidence suggests the crates dated from 1944, when retreating German units fortified central Warsaw against the advancing Red Army. The bunker beneath the ministry site, once a German military communications hub, was likely used for emergency storage. Why these particular materials were hidden there remains unanswered, but the designation Einsatzgruppe Epsilon is chilling. Known Einsatzgruppen operated across Eastern Europe, conducting mass executions, yet no official post-war record mentions an Epsilon unit. The tapes may represent the only surviving trace. In 1992, a former Polish intelligence officer, speaking under anonymity, described hearing one of the reels played briefly before Soviet removal. According to his testimony, the tape contained a German officer's voice, identified as SS Hauptsturmführer Dieter M., recounting field experiments in occupied Belarus. He spoke of dispersion tests using aerosolized compounds on civilian villages. Casualty reports were listed not in names but in numbers. The officer recalled, "It was systematic, clinical, without emotion. It was not execution, it was measurement." His statement was never published officially, and within 2 years he had emigrated. Supporting evidence comes from a stray page within the Soviet archives leaked in 2001. It describes captured German audio documents, Warsaw 1981, classified as chemical warfare atrocities. The note recommends that tapes be archived under KGB file CX92 and never released due to potential for destabilization of Warsaw Pact alliances. The implication is clear. Moscow feared exposure of atrocities too severe to control politically, possibly implicating not only German perpetrators, but also post-war complicit silence. Why would the West remain silent as well? In 1994, a British Foreign Office release revealed a 1982 cable from the Warsaw Embassy. It notes, credible reports of German chemical warfare evidence seized by Soviets, request for verification denied. Given public mood in Poland, disclosure could embolden anti-Soviet dissent. Recommend no inquiry. The British assessment reveals the calculation, better to ignore war crimes evidence than risk inflaming unrest during the Cold War. There are also suggestions that the tapes implicated individuals who escaped justice. One rumor circulating among Polish dissidents in the 1980s claimed the name of a senior SS chemist, later rumored to have worked for Western intelligence, was spoken on the recordings. If true, such a revelation could have embarrassed both East and West. The files of Operation Paperclip and its Soviet equivalents are already filled with names of former Nazi scientists absorbed into Cold War projects. Could Einsatzgruppe Epsilon's personnel have been among them? The sealed metal container remains the greatest enigma. Witnesses recall it was heavy, requiring 2 soldiers to lift, and emitted a faint chemical odor when breached. The Soviets removed it without cataloging its contents. No trace has surfaced since. Some speculate it contained physical samples, canisters of agents used in field trials. Others suggest it held documents too sensitive to file, perhaps contracts linking industrial firms to the atrocities. Whatever the truth, the container has disappeared into Moscow's archives, perhaps destroyed, perhaps still buried. In Warsaw itself, the story lingered as rumor. Workers who handled the crates whispered of tapes filled with the voices of murderers. Families of resistance veterans demanded answers in the early 1990s, pressing the new Polish government to investigate. But officials replied that the materials were no longer under Polish custody. The trail ended in Moscow. When Russian archivists were questioned in 2005, they denied knowledge of any Epsilon files. Yet researchers noted that the KGB inventory for 1982 contains an unexplained entry: 17 magnetic reels, foreign language, restricted access. The emotional impact cannot be overstated. For decades, Poland had lived under competing shadows, the memory of Nazi occupation and the weight of Soviet control. The Warsaw bunker tapes united both in silence, German crimes erased by Soviet secrecy, Western governments complicit through inaction. Survivors of wartime atrocities were denied even the validation of knowing their suffering had been recorded, documented, acknowledged. One final fragment surfaced in 2011 when a Polish historian gained access to ministry renovation logs from 1981. Among mundane entries about plumbing and wiring, one line stands out: discovery of subterranean chamber, crates with insignia, work halted, resumed only after intervention of military police. The handwriting is hurried as if added in haste. It corroborates the worker's story, a fleeting trace of a moment quickly buried. Today, no copy of the tapes is known to exist. No transcript has ever been released. Only fragments, memos, testimonies, marginal notes point toward their contents. The term Einsatzgruppe Epsilon remains absent from Nuremberg records, absent from SS archives, absent from the public memory of the war. If it existed, it was erased with deliberate care. And yet, in the hidden archives of Moscow, or perhaps in some forgotten crate moved during Poland's chaotic 1980s, the voices of men confessing unspeakable acts may still wait. Waiting not to be heard, but to remind the world of crimes too monstrous for even victors to reveal. The files remain sealed, the witnesses long dead, and the evidence scattered in vaults no one admits exist. Yet the silence itself speaks, an echo of crimes never tried, weapons never acknowledged, experiments never confessed. Every missing page is a wound that refuses to close, a reminder that history does not forgive what it conceals. In the cold corridors of secrecy, one truth lingers. The war never truly ended. It was simply buried.